let's look at urban change, particularly urban change with regards to deindustrialization and decentralization. So I'd expect you to go back and complete these key vocabulary once we have been through the lesson. So as your starter question to think about, assess the extent to which deindustrialization affects the character of cities. So this is, we're considering how the closure of industry is going to affect what a city is like. So you need to consider obviously the social, economic, environmental and political factors that would change because of deindustrialization. So the closure of factories. So you can think about the effect on people. Think about how it's going to affect their way of life. Think about how it's going to affect their mental health, their physical health, whether it affects whether they're going to carry on living in that area or not. Think about economic. So obviously people are going to lose their jobs. So what's that going to do to the area? Are other jobs going to come in and fill the gap? Is it going to change what that place is like? Environmental. So of course, if you're getting factories closing, factories being left derelict, what's that going to do to the area? But on the plus side, of course, without the factories being there, air pollution becomes less of a problem. Politically, if an area, generally places that are mostly industrial tend to be more, in the UK, more Labour voting. Now, if those areas change and become more economically viable, because you're getting things like the East End of London where you've had the London Docklands, then maybe you'll get a political shift. But maybe an area that's deindustrialised, so more unemployment, could lead to a greater vote for the Labour Party. So a range of different factors you need to consider there: your social, economic, environmental and political. So the thing is, you've got to think about a city as a living thing. Cities change all the time. Cities are places that are never the same. You know, they're constantly in flux. So very often we do talk about them as a living thing, the urban metabolism. So how they require energy, food, water, raw materials, but they produce a huge lot of waste as well. So there is a video within the PowerPoint that you can watch about the urban metabolism. Now, deindustrialization. Deindustrialization has been a major factor in most HICs, and particularly in the UK during the 1970s and 80s. This is the long-term decline of manufacturing, or what we call heavy industry, making things like cars and ships, etc. And there are a number of common factors that lead to that have caused this deindustrialization. And that's what we're going to be looking at. So in the UK, particularly in the sort of 70s and 80s, this was a major factor. So let's look at the causes. So mechanization. You just don't need as many people in factories anymore. So you don't need as many people employed in factories because of mechanization. You have computers and robots doing the work. They are more productive, less likely to cause mistakes, and of course work 24/7 if you want to. And you don't have the problem of having to pay them wages or them joining a union. So mechanization has led to deindustrialization. Competition is a major factor. So we've had the rise of this outsourcing of this industry: Taiwan, India, China, South Africa, Brazil, all places where it's just cheaper to get things made abroad now. It's just cheaper in so many different factors that we'll look at and explore to get things made in other countries rather than in places such as the UK. We've got globalization. Now, again, this is sort of going on as a continuation of what we just looked at, this whole outsourcing, and particularly because of transnational corporations. So you're getting companies that are based in those older HIC countries, but then making their products in the LICs just for all the cheaper costs that are involved. We are seeing believe it or not, a decline in the requirement of sort of manufactured goods. More and more people in HICs want services, they want experiences, they want to go out and have meals or go and have an adventure. Not so interested in just buying product anymore. So that's led to a decline in industry in the UK and other HICs. The cost of raw materials has had an effect as well. So not at the precise moment, but generally over time, raw material prices have increased. So like oil prices have increased, making it very difficult to actually have a cost-effective heavy industrial factories in places like the UK, because the raw materials are just too expensive. There are other costs as well. So environmental laws. So to protect air quality, noise, pollution, etc., there are environmental restrictions in HICs that just aren't there in LICs. So that extra cost, the extra cost involved with labour as well, having to pay for sort of sick pay, maternity pay, things like that. So the increased costs has led to deindustrialisation in places like the UK. So we've seen quite literally millions of jobs lost in places such as the UK. And this has affected those towns and cities, mostly in northern England, the old traditional industrial cities such as Newcastle and Sheffield. And this has led to a massive change in the socio-economic makeup of those places. So we can see here the impacts that we've got. So the economic impacts, some of these that we discussed at the beginning. So loss of jobs, personal disposable income. So of course, then you get your negative multiplier effect. If people haven't got disposable income, they're not spending in other businesses. So the local shops, the local restaurants will be affected because of the industry closing. So you've got the negative multiplier effect. And then you've got other businesses that support that industry, the suppliers of things to that factory. Loss of council tax, so that means loss of local services, loss of money to support people within the area, loss of money to look after the area. An increased demand for benefits, so obviously it has a major economic impact for the country. A loss of income for service sector, as we said, so that could mean that people end up leaving the area. Property prices decline. People start to leave the area because you don't want to live in this area with very few jobs. And so leading to this demultiplier effect or negative multiplier effect. Social impacts, increased unemployment, higher levels of deprivation in an area. Again, outward migration. Usually those people who are more qualified and more prosperous and younger will move out, leaving behind people who are older and less qualified. So again, you end up into this sort of spiral of decline. Higher levels of crime, family breakdowns, alcohol and drug abuse, other social problems due to deindustrialization. Because we've got to think of the impact that you have, particularly that sort of traditional sort of male role of working in the factory, looking after the family, and that being lost. And that can lead to a number of social problems. Say, loss of confidence and morale in a local population. So linking back to your changing places topic, that it's changed what the place is like, how people feel about that place. Environmental impacts, derelict land and buildings, long-term pollution. So you'll have factories that will leave behind pollutants, even though the factory is no longer open. Deteriorating infrastructure, so the decay, the decline of the infrastructure around people. They have reduced income to look after properties, and so does the council, so the area becomes more run down. But you do lose noise pollution, air pollution, and traffic pollution and water pollution because the factory is no longer there. So why was it so bad in the UK? Well, firstly, our factories were protected by a thing called protectionism, so that there were laws in place putting tariffs on imported goods and quotas. So if somebody bought something in from abroad, it would cost more. So they were protected. They didn't have to be efficient. They could work in a very inefficient way and still make sure they've got their jobs. Trade unions. So again, particularly if you look back at any videos, anything about the 1970s, the trade unions had a real grip on the UK, and strikes were pretty common, and the number of hours worked went down, the amount of pay went up, and the output wasn't there to cover it. UK investors started to see the opportunities of investing abroad. They could see that there were higher returns in investing their money in foreign countries rather than in the UK. And again, linked to our protectionism, our factories were outdated. The machinery we had was outdated because, I mean, you could link it back to that we were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so the factories weren't really fit for purpose anymore, and they were set up in ways that didn't really work. And exchange rates. So this meant that it was actually cheaper to buy things from abroad. When the oil was discovered in the North Sea, it became cheaper to buy things from abroad than it was to have in the UK because of favourable exchange rates. So again, in your PowerPoint, you'll see a video, The Death of Industry, very worthwhile watching. So decentralisation, we've looked at deindustrialisation, so decentralisation. So you've had those factories that were in the centre of the cities. And what had happened is some people had already moved out of the centre of the cities to the suburbs. We'd already had suburbanisation. People could move out into the suburbs, live in an area with fresher air, bigger gardens, tree-lined streets, those sort of things. And this was particularly because of the growth of the private car and also the increase in public transport. So we'd already seen decentralisation of people moving to the suburbs to get away from the pollution, the crowdedness, and the costs of the city. What we're now starting to see is decentralisation of services. So we are used to seeing these big out-of-town supermarkets, these big out-of-town sort of sheds, as they're called, like your B&Qs, etc. Even big out-of-town shopping malls in that sort of traditional American sort of model. We're even starting to see offices decentralising. So a good example would be Whiteley Village on the way between Portsmouth and Southampton. You've got this business park of offices in grounds with green parks around them, water features and lakes, etc. So a pleasant working environment, which is easily accessible by the M27, and the rents are cheaper as well. It's a better place for people to work. So you need to summarize the effects of decentralization on urban areas. So you've got to think about, decentralization on urban areas and think about the impact it would have. Now, in the UK, we have had the rise of the service economy. We are what is also known as a post-industrial society. So industry has gone, manufacturing has gone, but services has come to replace it. Again, this particularly happened during the 1980s and 1990s. So you can see here some of the facts here. Service sector dominates London's economy. 91% of London's economy is in the service sector. So hugely significant, hugely important. 79% of the GDP of the UK came from the service sector in 2013. So you can see just how we have transitioned away, how it was only 46% in 1948. And the percentage of workers in the service sector, you can see 80% by 2011 are working in the service industry. Now, of course, this has positives as well, because we know that as you go from primary, secondary to tertiary and quaternary, the two service sectors, the amount of money and often in the wages increase for people as you move through those types of industry. So why have we had this? So we've had the growth of the corporate headquarters, those multinationals, those TNCs that locate in HICs, in particularly world cities such as London, and then get the work done, the manual work, the manufacturing work done elsewhere. We've also seen a growth in what's called the knowledge economy. So it's not about what you make, it's about what you know. So legal, financial, advertising, IT, media, those sort of things. There's no physical final product, but there is great value from the knowledge that you have and the skills that you have. And again, that rise in the service sector. So enjoying going for meals out, leisure activities, those sort of things. The increase in tourism as people are becoming more and more able to travel around the world, cheaper flights, more disposable income as we're having fewer children, um, increased car ownership so people can travel around and go to more places. And also, we're seeing the rise in the development of property and investment in property and people wanting to own their own property. So rather than getting into manufacturing, you can make your money through that as well. And here you can see that shift. So we've got services, manufacturing, and agriculture and fishing. And obviously, there are some primaries missing from that final one, but you get the overall trend you can see here with this graph. You can see how it has changed over time and how we've had that big drop off from the 1960s, particularly the 60s to the 80s. You can see that massive drop in manufacturing, but that also being countered with the rise in services replacing it. Now, of course, the question is, has this really benefited everyone? Now, some people would argue that very often manufacturing jobs are low paid, low skilled, and so they provide employment to people who have lower skills. However, you could argue that many of these service jobs are, because they are knowledge economy, they require skills and high levels of education. So there's not the opportunity, there's not a direct replacement. And very often the jobs that are lower paid and lower skilled in the service industry tend to be part-time or temporary and so are not very reliable for people to have. So unemployment is still a problem in many HICs because you've not had a direct replacement for all of those jobs left. Those low skilled jobs in manufacturing have not all been directly replaced by those service economy jobs. And so you do tend to see within the inner cities, and we are seeing this across when we've looked at Detroit and when we look at other countries, you have the poverty in the inner cities of HIC countries. And again, when we will travel and go to the East End of London, and we will see the poverty next to the wealth. So we'll go to Canary Wharf and look at that. Research and development, that quaternary sector, is the area where we're seeing the big growth and also the biggest money being made. Now, this research and development tends to happen near to existing universities, so you're getting that sort of synergy. So, for example, the Cambridge Science Park obviously links in and has a strong links with Cambridge University, so they can get people straight from the university into their industry. So, for research and development, very often into IT or pharmaceuticals or software development, whatever it might be. And what you can see from the photograph is how it provides them everything you would need. You've got housing there, you've got childcare there, you've got transport links there, and you've got the surrounding countryside, so it makes it a nice place in which to live. So these sort of science parks have become very popular around university cities. So I want you to consider the effects of the rise of the service economy on urban areas. So bringing together everything that we have looked at, bringing that all together in that final question. And I want you to have a look at the Cambridge Science Park and see what industries are found there, see how long they've been there, maybe try and group those companies into different sectors. Are they IT? Are they communications? Are they pharmaceuticals? Okay, thank you very much.